today let's go down the road of observation. We're going to go down the rabbit hole and see how far it goes. So there's this natural force that we have to take in and observe. This force is all around us, and the more you take the time to look, the more you're going to find it. So we have these two opposing forces that work alongside each other, against each other, and neutralizes each other. So this force is a push and a pull force. So on the horizontal plane, horizontal axis, the, the push is actually going this way. The pull is actually going this way because this is the center. The center, this is the pull, this is the push. So you have this force going this way. That's the horizontal plane. On the vertical plane, we have this. This is the push, and then we have the pull. Push, and then pull. So we got these opposite forces working, again, against each other, along each other, or it cancels out. It becomes neutral. So what I mean by that is if you take your hands, pretend these two are two objects coming together, and as they meet in the middle, what's going to happen is if this hand produces 100 kilos of force going this way, and this one only produces 80 kilos, what's going to happen? This is going to win. So the only way that it's going to stabilize is that both these forces cancel out each other, 100 kilos and 100 kilos going this way. And then it stabilizes. You'll see this in wrestling. Two people come in the middle, and then you'll see this. They just stay. Or you'll start to see this. One force winning over the other, but they're always exerting force. That's why wrestling is extremely tiring. It's not just one, it's three-dimensional. They're going circular, back, forth, up and down. It's very, very tiring. So yeah, you have this force going against each other. Okay, now watch this. If one force is producing, if these two forces cancel each other out, but my wrist becomes not strong enough to withstand the force, it does this. This is what happens. Unstable. Okay, so the only way these forces can come together and push against each other is that the hinges have to have the stability to withhold that force. So let's say this is 100 kilos, it's holding force, 110, 120, 130, 140. It starts to break apart. So as the load increases, we have to strengthen certain parts. If it's a stabilizer, we have to strengthen certain parts to keep that together. And again, forearm, stabilizer, these two. There's another observation that happens when these two connect, and that is the molecules, the particles in between the molecules start to get denser and denser, and as they get denser and denser, there's friction that is created and heat is created. Now if you go one step further and these two get extremely tight and dense, what you end up with is light. Keep that in mind. So when two matter becomes really close and they're moving extremely fast and they're like rubbing against each other really quick, you end up with light. Now on camera, this looks like it's not moving, but what's actually happening between these two is that you're storing potential energy. Without potential energy, you cannot release kinetic energy. Keep that in mind. Without potential energy, you will not be able to release kinetic energy. Meaning, your kinetic energy cannot exceed your potential energy. Okay? You need more potential energy to produce more kinetic energy. Okay? Very important. So when we see these two forces come together and they cancel out, within each other, you're creating potential energy. Okay, this is gonna blow your mind. Okay, so here we go. So here's my table. You see this table? This is the world's observation. Okay. So just like how if one hand is producing more than the other, it's gonna beat its force. It's gonna push it that way. The only way it stays at that certain point is that if these two forces meet and they produce the same thing. So if you look at the TV, how is it standing on a table? It's standing on the table because the table is pushing up the same amount of mass that the TV is pushing down. That's why it stays. Same thing with all objects on the table. That's mind-blowing, isn't it? Now, let's take it one step further. What's holding up the table? The floor. So the floor is now pushing all this energy up to hold everything in place. If it didn't have that kind of energy to push it up, everything will just fall down. It'll just crash down. What's holding up the house? The ground. What's holding up the ground? The earth. So now you start to see all this pattern where the earth is constantly pushing things in by gravity, but it's also pushing things out. If it's not pushing out, things will just collapse in. Okay? Very interesting. So now we look at this table and we find its center of mass. So it's right at the middle of the table. If you have a load, so maximum load, so like let's say the elevator. So if you go in an elevator and on top where the buttons are, you'll see max load. Okay, that's the maximum load that elevator can hold. Every object has a maximum load that it can hold. But if you stack that maximum load at the center of the mass that it's holding on, this whole thing is going to bend down because that's the weakest point. That's the weakest point. It's a double-edged sword. You can apply this for martial arts. Okay. Now, let me share something else. So I was talking about force going in. Now let's talk about force going out. See if you guys can see this. So before I even begin explaining this, these two pins is pushing the force up enough to hold this board up. If you put more force that these two pins can hold, this thing's gonna fall. That's why we always put nails in the stud. In the middle of the stud is the strongest. Just keep that in mind. Okay, and if you find it, this stuff, this board will stay here forever. It's just gonna It's gonna stay in place forever. The force is canceling out. The only thing that it might fall is the decay of matter. So good observation to think about when you're looking at objects. What object is holding what and what's sustaining what. We're going to come back to potential energy and kinetic back. So let's say this and this is like two opposite forces pushing against each other. Okay, they're going this way. So before I was doing the hand, they're coming together. Now we're going to do forces going this way. When you have, let's say, a truck pulling this way and a truck pulling this way, the center of the string is going to be the most stressed. That's the biggest stress point. And because these forces are pushing out, what's tying them together is actually the center. So the center of the mass is actually pulling these two objects together. If it was not pulling these two objects together, these two objects would just go its own way. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, as these two objects are pulling, it's storing potential energy. Okay. This diagram, as it's pulling against each other, it's storing potential energy. How do you store more potential energy? There's two ways. One, you make the string longer, or you end up pulling harder against each other. So if this is going 100 kilometers, there's only 100 kilometers of potential energy that's stored up. If this is going 200 and 200, now there's 200. But it can only store so much before this breaks. And what's happening is that there's two forces going on. This thing is going this way, and then the string is going this way to keep it together. So you end up with this energy that's constantly going like back and forth. So if you're standing at the end of this car or this truck and it's not moving and you touch the end of it, you can actually feel the pulse of the truck. These two trucks are constantly pulling away, but the string, you'll see this pulse. It's like they're gonna pull and they're gonna come back, pull, come back, pull, come back. That's what's actually happening inside the string. So this energy is going away. It hits the end of the truck, it's coming back in, and it's going away. And then these two are constantly hitting each other. At the center, you're going to create heat and friction. That's the first point that this object is going to break apart. Pretty cool, eh? So when there's a pulling and pushing force, what ends up happening is that we're going to get an onset. And with onset, you get time. And to tell time, you get a pulse. So if I said a word and I sustain that word for a very long time, there's no onset, there's no pulse. So we don't know the time of that. But if it's like, so for example, if I do do, that's like a dead heartbeat. Da, it's just, but if you hear da, 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 now we have a pulse. And because of that pulse, now we can tell the time in between those onsets. So when we're exerting, when we're creating potential and kinetic energy, it becomes a pulse. What does this look like? It's like a heartbeat. It's like pulling in, and it's also pushing out, pulling in, pushing out, pulling in, pushing out. When we exercise, whether it's anything. Yeah, when we exercise, lifting weights, you'll see this even more in bodybuilding. So for example, when I'm pulling in like this, what I'm actually doing within the muscle is I'm creating this potential energy. As I'm pulling this in, I'm creating even more potential energy to be released into kinetic. And there's a pulse. Deek, 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 deek. Keep that in mind, because whenever we do squats, deadlift, bench, I don't know, any other movement, swimming, throwing, all these things, there's a pulse. And we follow that pulse because when we follow it, you're actually maximizing the energy output. Sometimes arrows can be tricky. So here's a matter. Here's the center. Both arrows are pointing the same way, but the force is different. This is going towards the center. This is going away from the center. So sometimes in a diagram, because it's two-dimensional, it's kind of hard to tell which direction things are going. So this is a pull, this is a push. Pull and push. This is for a vertical axis. Horizontal axis, same idea. There's two arrows, but they're going the same way, but they're very different forces. This way, going towards the center. This way is going away from the center. This is a pull to the center. This is a push away from the center. So, man, this video is getting long. Okay, maybe I should break it up. Well, all right. That's all I want to say for today, man. Hope this is educational. I guess I'll break it up to other parts. It's getting longer than I thought. Enjoy the rest of the day. Happy Sunday. Cheers. Peace.